You are now listening to a podcast made in collaboration with the Copenhagen College Radio.
Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to episode 41, the Social Media and Politics Podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, political scientist at the University of Copenhagen. If you're on Twitter, you can tweet us at SMNP Podcast or check out the live streams on our Facebook page, facebook.com/Social Media and Politics Podcast. All right, y'all, new year, new episodes, and we're kicking off 2018 with an episode on online political games. And what do I mean by online political games? Basically, we're talking about video games that have a political profile to them and can be spread and go viral on social media. And I've seen a few of these crop up in the context of either the Brexit referendum or the 2017 British election, which, if you need a quick brush up on your British politics, we talk about that election in episodes 28, 27, and 25 of this podcast. But today we're going to be speaking with James Moulding. He's one of the co-founders of an organization called Games for the Many, which aims to use the power of play to change politics. And James and his team created a viral game in the 2017 British elections called Corbyn Run, where you play as Labour Party leader Jeremy Corbyn, and you run through a British town, knocking over Conservative members of Parliament and different bankers and take their money and put it back into social services. And as you run, you have a people power gauge that charges up, and then you can release different manifesto pledges or parts of the party's platform, such as giving money back to the NHS or raising the minimum wage. And to give you an idea of that game, I'm going to play a little sound clip from it. At least that's the best I can do in this podcast format. But I think it can still give you an idea about how the game goes. So let's see here. Here we go. All right, so those coin sounds you hear, kind of like from Mario, is me knocking over MPs, and the thuds are potholes in the streets. And here we go. That's a manifesto pledge that says "Save our NHS," and a bunch of nurses came running behind me and joining the movement of Jeremy Corbyn. So yeah, it's good fun. And if you want to check out the game, you can go to corbynrun.com and play it. It takes all of about 3 minutes. But as I was playing this game, I was thinking, like, what is the potential for these online games to increase interest or participation, particularly among youth, right? Because they're kind of the target demo for these type of games. So I went and I dug a bit into the academic literature to see if I could find anything on online games, and there really wasn't much, but there has been some work done in the context of video gaming. And what those studies tend to show is that the frequency of playing games doesn't really have an effect on your engagement in civic and political life, but the type of games that you play does have a small but significant effect on your likelihood to be engaged in civic activities or politics. So if you're playing games that deal with moral or social issues like The Sims, where you have to raise a family, or even games that have like leadership or team building exercises. So one of the things that I thought was interesting was a very popular game called Halo, which is quite violent. You're shooting different aliens and slaying them down with futuristic swords. But because you're playing as leader of a squadron or part of a team, it has this community building aspect that seems to have a positive correlation with engaging in civic and political activities. So there does seem to be a potential for games to have positive democratic effects. So I was interested to learn more about what's going on in this space of online political games. And in this interview, James and we talk about his experiences in building the game Corbyn Run, which one of the things I thought was quite interesting is that they were working on a completely different project, and then Theresa May called a snap election. So an impromptu election to increase her majority. James has a different idea about why she did, which we get into. But we also talk about the role of social media in promoting the game. We talk about where the motivations for the game came from, what types of data were collected, and where Games for the Many is going in the future. So stay tuned, and I hope you enjoy the interview. My guest today is James Moulding. He's a campaigner and activist who's previously worked as a fellow at the New Speak House, and he has a background in tech for good. He's one of the co-founders of Games for the Many, and you can follow him on Twitter at James for the Many. James, thanks so much for taking the time out, and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thanks, Michael. It's good to be here.
So to start out, can you give us a bit of an introduction into Games for the Many? What's the organization's mission and who makes up your team?
Absolutely. Games for Many is a new organization. We formed out the back of the success of the game Corbyn Run during the general election 2017. We're primarily focused on building a nationwide community in the UK of political game makers and getting political activists and campaigners in the same room with, say, games developers, designers, and those kind of figures to widen the possibility space around the use of political games and digital campaigning tools. We're also specifically focused as a studio on developing those games in a strategic approach that benefits the Labour Party in upcoming elections.
And how did you come to start this project? I mean, getting involved with games. Is it a team of hardcore gamers or activists or like entrepreneurs trying to fill a niche in the market? I mean, how did you get this thing started?
So I've been working with the Labour Party, with John McDonnell more specifically, for a number of years on a range of different projects running from the Digital Bill of Rights to digital democracy work in the last couple of years to the Digital Democracy Manifesto last summer, during Jeremy Corbyn's last leadership campaign. Mm-hmm. The game and the team formed around the run-up to the 2017 general election. When that was called, one of the more recent projects of the digital democracy work we were doing was cancelled immediately because we were working on crowdfunding the 2020 general election manifesto using digital democracy tools, and suddenly we didn't need a 2020 general election manifesto and didn't have the time to do that.
Right, because it was a snap election, right?
Absolutely. So we spoke to John McDonnell's team and the Labour Party social media team and the digital team, and it was kind of a crunch time. Like, this was the do or die moment for the Labour left, the Jeremy Corbyn project. And we put forward the idea of, if this is going to be it, like, why don't we put it all in and let's make a game? We felt that a game would be something that would be very accessible to like core demographic groups when the Labour Party is trying to do its campaigning. At the same time, as a kind of third party project, we never really expected the full backing of the Labour Party. So that wasn't really an aspect of that. So what we essentially did was we transferred the money that we had for a different project to Corbyn Run, and that enabled us to like get going really, really quickly. So from the very start of the general election campaign, it was like April 28th or something. It was really early on. There was a game jam the following weekend, immediately after the election was called. So I got all of my game design friends, and I contacted a friend of mine, Rosa Carbo-Mascarell, who's now the co-founder of Games for the Many alongside me. And we pulled together a team of 9 designers and developers, and we sat down during that game jam and we scoped out what became the forerunner to Corbyn Run, because there were 2 different iterations of the game, which it might be better to talk about later. But our backgrounds are more specifically, I'm a political activist and campaigner, and I've worked in tech startups and have a familiarity with some of the aspects like virality and all this kind of stuff. And Rosa is, she's a game designer first and foremost, and a digital strategist and an artist, and like an indie developer. And we both have a familiarity, and we became friends through like several years ago through situationism, through different appreciation situations. I come from a political angle, and she comes from a more kind of literary standpoint. So that's our team as it currently stands.
So just to recap, you were working on something for the 2020 election, then Theresa May calls a snap election, and it was basically, okay, we have to move now. And so you decided to do a game.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
Interesting. So yeah, let's get into the basic gameplay, and maybe you can start with what it is, the final product, Corbyn Run, and then maybe what it was before, if there were 2 different iterations. So what's the basic gameplay of Corbyn Run if we were to go and play it, right now?
Okay. So if you were to play Corbyn Run, you'd be presented with Jeremy Corbyn standing in a generic English town with crumbling infrastructure and crumbling buildings and shop fronts behind him, and there's potholes in the road. And this is an endless runner game. So it's a side-scrolling game. He runs to the right. As he's running, Tory MPs, Bullingdon Boys, that's a private school in in the UK that is very exclusive, that Boris Johnson and David Cameron and former Tory MPs and stuff have voted before. And there's tax avoiders and bankers, and Jeremy's goal is to frisk down these bankers and Tory MPs, and from that he both gains cash and fills a bar of people power up. And once that bar of people power is fully replenished, he can launch manifesto pledges. So they're Labour manifesto pledges. And once you launch a manifesto pledge, it comes up with, the first one is, I think it's something like save our NHS. And the second one is abolition of tuition fees. And the third one is house building, all this kind of stuff. So there's 5 Labour manifesto pledges. They're specifically focused to a target audience of 18 to 25-year-olds, which we were specifically targeting with the game. And every time you launch one of those pledges and it comes in your face, it's really obvious to you. So it's kind of like it's educational in that we're exposing the hundreds of thousands of people who played the game to basic aspects of the Labour Party manifesto. Instead of hundreds of thousands of leaflets through people's doors, we're presenting a 3.5-minute game that presents to you the core aspects of the Labour Party manifesto. And every single time that one of those manifesto pledges kicks off, so Jeremy's running along and he's like tackling the Tory tax dodgers and the bankers, and depending on the pledge, so if it's Save Our NHS, a group of nurses join Jeremy. If it's £10 minimum wage, a group of Deliveroo cyclists join Jeremy. And eventually, over time, as you go through the various manifesto pledges, of which there are 5, you build up a movement surrounding Jeremy. And you also have to put up with the onslaughts of some of the Tory bosses. So you have Theresa May in her private helicopter, and then you have like Jeremy Hunt flying in his Virgin private jet, and Boris Johnson dropping Union Jacks on you from the Olympic zip line, and Margaret Thatcher spitting the tears of the working class at you, and all this kind of stuff. And then
the ghost of Margaret Thatcher, right?
The ghost of Margaret Thatcher. And then finally you have to defeat Theresa May and her battle bus, and then you surpass her campaign, because that's symbolically passing their campaign, with the movement that Jeremy Corbyn has surrounded himself with. And then you're presented with a screen as a bit of a victory celebration, and you're presented a screen with Vote Labour June the 8th, and you've raised this much amount, and share to Twitter, Facebook. And our CTA towards the end of the period was, because we changed this during the course of the game, was lend your voice to the campaign. So you click lend your voice and you were taken to a Thunderclap page, if you're familiar with Thunderclap.
Mm-hmm. It's like a crowdfunding type of, or no, it's for, we mentioned it on a previous episode, but yeah, could you remind us what it is?
Yeah, so when you clicked on lend your voice, you went to a Thunderclap, and Thunderclap is basically your ability to aggregate. When you set up a Thunderclap, you have a message, and people can sign up to that message, and you'll basically all schedule a tweet at the same time through accepting this Thunderclap. So when people go to lend your voice, they say, yes to the Thunderclap. And then on election day, we had like a few hundred people send out this Thunderclap. The idea, the problem with that was that we didn't set up that CTA, we didn't set up that Thunderclap until like the weekend before, after which the virality had gone, because of reasons outside of our control. If we'd have done that early, we'd have had tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people on that Thunderclap, and we could have had a massive impact on election day, or maybe some sort of viral hashtag. So that was definitely something that we could have improved on later.
Yeah, it reminded me, I don't know how familiar you are with these games, but it reminded me of somewhere of a mix between Contra 3, the Alien Wars, and Streets of Rage, if you know them. Streets of Rage, where it's a side scroller on a street. I think you're different types of cops, and then you can kind of call in a special missile strike. And that was kind of like the Corbyn pledges. So I got a kick out of it. But what was it like in the beginning? So you mentioned it had changed. That was the final product. But was the original having the same core kind of gameplay or core message, or?
No, absolutely not. The game radically changed. So as I mentioned before, I'm a political analyst at a crowdfunding startup, Crowdpack, and it's kind of my job to be in touch on top of the political environment and what's going on. And in the 2015 general election, the bottom line is the Tories didn't have enough activists on the ground. So they put all of their best activists, of which there were not many, into one bus. And the story went that they drove the bus around to various campaigning seats. And there was an accusation that they fiddled the expenses of where the bus had gone. So there was a scandal. And as a result, there were like between 5 and 30 implicated MPs for where that battle bus had gone. So that meant between 5 and 30 by-elections. So in the UK, a by-election is very similar to a United States special election. So I was of the general belief that Theresa May wasn't really calling in the general election to increase her majority. There's going to be like 30 by-elections held over the course of the next following months if the court case had gone through. And by-elections are very different to a general election. They tend to be very focused on local issues. You can't necessarily guarantee that just because you have like really high national polling, like the Tories did, they were 20 points ahead of the Labour Party, which meant that she had the confidence to carry out the snap general election with that confidence that she did. By-elections can go anyway. They don't necessarily go the way that national polling goes. So the game was originally called Grand Theft Tory, and it was originally about herding those 15 to 30 alleged scandalous MPs into prison. And it was very much kind of like a sheepdog chasing the sheep kind of game. Yeah, and then after 2 or 3 weeks out of a 6-week general election campaign, we had to change everything because the Crown Prosecution Service in the UK basically ditched they ditched the investigation into the MPs, which meant that we no longer had a game. And the Labour Party spoke to us and said we should probably change the messaging from Grand Theft Tory to something more positive. Right.
So the political context basically just changed in the middle of this project.
Yeah, which basically meant we had to make a new game in a very, very short amount of time. So we just changed absolutely everything. The game, instead of being about chasing through MPs, which was quite negative, and I don't think it would have gone viral or anything like that. It would have been interesting and maybe it got a bit of pickup, but Corbyn Run was the complete opposite. Corbyn Run was positive. It was about a movement. And it presented Labour Party policy, it was educational, it's all of these different things, and it's funny, more importantly.
Yeah, because I think, I agree that it's definitely a net positive in terms of the gameplay, right? One of the things I noticed is it's very hard for Jeremy Corbyn to lose. He can run out of energy, but he never really dies, so to say. But, there is an element of negativity in, knocking over Tories or, it has some small degree of violence in it. But I think the way it's done is very comical, which downplays that. So like, for example, it's almost like caricatures of politicians, which makes it seem much less negative.
Yeah. So were you familiar with the fiscal combat game?
I know it was from the French elections, and I'm assuming it's based off Mortal Kombat. It would be the idea.
Well, I assume so. Fiscal Combat was a game produced by a group called La France Insoumise, who were kind of that activist base for the Mélenchon's French presidential election campaign. They had a very similar relationship to Mélenchon's campaign in the same way that Corbyn Run did, except for they'd had a slightly longer relationship in that they built some website or something beforehand very well. And Fiscal Combat essentially involved Mélenchon by himself, which is important. There was no movement around Mélenchon in the game, despite there being movement in real life. So that's something that we took and said, our game should include that movementist aspect. And in their game, it was Mélenchon running around, shaking down bankers and opposition MPs for cash. But I think he was actually being beaten up by them. It was a lot more violent. And the game was very long, and there wasn't really. You have to play it for like 10 minutes or something to get to the end point. But it's a very good game, and it inspired us and kind of gave us like a base point understanding of where we should go with this. So that's something that we definitely built upon.
So it was kind of inspired, but you were able to kind of adapt it to a more positive message.
Yeah, absolutely. So we improved upon Fiscal Combat in a sense, in that whereas Mélenchon was by himself in Fiscal Combat, we made sure that there was a movement around Jeremy Corbyn that reflected the nature of the campaign in the Labour Party at that time. So if you think about what was happening the political circumstances in May, it was crazy. So in those first 3 weeks where we were working on the sheepdog battle bus scandal game, like Labour was 20 points behind in the polls. Activists were disillusioned. John McDonnell and Jeremy Corbyn were running around the country, kickstarting massive rallies. But the public polling was still like down in the dumps. The Tories were still like very overconfident, if anything. And then halfway through the election campaign, as we were making Corbyn Run, everything turned around, and Corbyn Run reflects that. It reflects that shift to this movementist tone. It reflects the shift to a more positive campaign where the Tories are really in trouble, from U-turns on core policy to not releasing financial details around their manifesto, to a number of different things that gave Labour Party supporters like in the last 3 weeks, a breath of fresh air. And yeah, there was this positive energy. There were massive rallies all across the country that like thousands of people went to. And I'd like to think we played some role in that.
Yeah, which I guess is reflected in the type of, the game itself, right? Like it's a side scroller. Jeremy Corbyn is running towards some endpoint. It's a shorter game, right? And there's this movement, and the speed kind of picks up when you have the nurses and the food delivery guys with you. It kind of adds a pace to the game. So it's interesting. I think that was well done in reflecting that in the actual gameplay. And I want to ask you about how those decisions were arrived at. Was there a lot of discussion and deliberation about what the game should actually look like? And how did you actually make those decisions?
So these were done very, very quickly over the course of, I think, one day.
Okay.
And a lot of the design decisions were because we were in such a crunch period and we really had to get this stuff sorted in a few days after we'd switched from the previous iteration of Grand Theft Auto. We had a pretty clear idea of what we wanted. I think the core word you could probably summarize the game as, or like summarize the game around, would be momentum. Like you said, as the game progresses, your speed increases and movement increases in size, and you have all the various like policy aspects. But it's worth mentioning that we got to the end of the production process. So the game was ready to go, and our animator said to us, okay, so now we should increase the difficulty, right? My immediate reaction was absolutely not. If we want people to play through the various manifesto pledges, to get to the end and see the various calls to action, to vote on June the 8th, to lend their voice to the campaign, to share on social media and all the various other aspects, they have to be able to get through that. It has to be accessible. And it also means that it's not just for a certain demographic of people that, or 18 to 25s or 25 to 34s that, are familiar with playing games and like will sit through it for a few minutes. But by making it easier, by making it more accessible, it opens up that audience. That meant that, we had just as many people in, the older age brackets who perhaps like looked at it and saw a familiar retro game than what they were used to back in the 1980s. And I think that was really crucial. Instead of treating it as a game, some people call it propaganda, but I think that's a bit of a misdirection and misdefinition. It's more of a form of digital campaigning.
Mm-hmm. I have a couple questions kind of along that point about the resources needed to make one of these games. So you were under a lot of time pressure. Decisions probably didn't have as much time as you would have liked to make. But what type of resources does it take to build this type of game? In terms of the technical programming side, the creative art design side, and then the financial side. Are they complex to build, and are they relatively expensive or cheap?
Okay, in terms of design and the resources required, we went with opting for the game engine Unity. Unity is easily portable in the sense that you build it within a specific environment, and then you can basically wrap it in anything you want. So you can stick it in a web browser environment, or you can stick it in a mobile environment, iOS and Android and whatnot. So that's relatively easy. So we had a team of 9, including a designer, 2 political analysts, 2 designers, a full stack developer, and 2 developers. I think that's everyone. And political liaison for speaking with the Labour Party. There was a considerable number of man hours. We spent about 3 weeks making the game in a really, really crunch time. So people working weekends all the way through the days. Some of us took times out of our day job to work on this project. It's also worth mentioning that we used a lot of stock assets when building the game. So with Unity, there's a lot of kind of libraries that you can build upon. So from the Endless Runner assets, you can just build a game you can build a game very, very similar to Corbyn Run very, very quickly. Some of the main things that you have to do yourself, like animation, specific mechanics. We went to the effort of paying an animator and an illustrator to make the game look as it does in that kind of retro style. We also went out of our way to finance the conversion of, I don't expect you to be familiar with this, but there's an obscure Italian left-wing anthem that we used and converted to chiptune format, which is the game soundtrack. Bandera Rossa, which is also like Jeremy Corbyn's favorite song. Only one person realized that on the Reddit. But yeah, in terms of financial resources, we did it relatively cheaply.
So you can basically take kind of preloaded aspects from this Unity platform, like the side scrolling, and that's just all kind of like plug and play, and then you fill in your animation. Yeah,
and you just you add in the detail and add in the various mechanics and custom mechanics and stuff. That's still considerable development time, but it makes it a lot easier. So it reduces a development process from something like 3 months down to, say, I don't know, 3 weeks or 2 weeks.
Gotcha. And one of the things I thought was interesting, I was reading in one of your previous interviews, was that before you actually launched the game, you tested it on swing voters and Tory voters. How did you do that type of testing? And what was the reason behind looking at the swing and Tory voters? I mean, were there also Labour voters tested as well? I mean, so could you talk a little bit about that testing phase?
Okay. The testing phase was very short and very brief because we didn't have much time. We were given a bit of breathing room in the sense that we planned to launch the game, I think it was the 22nd of May. And we ended up launching the game on the 29th of May. Although we planned to launch on the 23rd or one of those days, I can't exactly remember. And what happened was there was a terrorist attack in Manchester, and we didn't feel like, and we spoke to some friends in Momentum and various other places, and we all generally felt like this would be a poor time to launch something like Corbyn Run. But that did give us one extra week of polishing the game, looking over the mechanics, making sure everything ran perfectly, and allowed us to spend a lot more time going through user testing. And we spec'd out a number of different groups, from Labour to Tory to swing voters and people who are normally apathetic. So we did that mostly through our friends, because we didn't have the time to write up surveys and send them out to various groups. I just kind of pinged them to activists that I knew and campaigners that I knew. Rosa sent them to the Dev Space London group, where she knew a few people that had outed themselves as Tories in the past, and she sent them the game, and they all thought it was really funny. They even thought the ghost of Margaret Thatcher was a nice touch. And when we realized that even if, Tory voters having quite a positive approach to this game, there's something special there, and that we shouldn't really be too worried about how Labour and Momentum might react to it, even though their reaction was very positive. In fact, so much so that I did a bit more public user testing on the day that was not supposed to be our launch day. We were supposed to launch on the Wednesday of the week before the general election. And on the morning of Monday, I got a bit cocky and posted the game, just kind of I'll test this and let me know what you think in a few of these private Momentum groups and campaigning groups, just 2 or 3 of them. And that was a bit naive in the sense that the people on those groups love the game so much, and there's not many people in those groups, that all of them shared the game and immediately went viral within 2 or 3 hours. And that was technically part of the testing process, but luckily the game was fully ready, and we already had worked on all our press releases and everything. So yeah, that was a really interesting experience where I was essentially doing some user testing and some A/B testing, and it turned into the launch.
Interesting. And I want to follow up on that. You mentioned virality. I think it's super interesting that entertainment for the game kind of cross-cut ideological lines. I think that's super interesting. But one of the things you mentioned in one of the media articles I was reading is that in designing the look of the game and the gameplay, you wanted to encourage virality. And can you talk a bit about what criteria that you added to the game in order to increase its ability to go viral?
Yep. So at the baseline is the difficulty, making it easy so that people actually progress through the game and actually get to the point of sharing it. That's really basic level thing. Other core aspects are the things that we've had as feedback from all the different sectors, all the different demographic groups, and all the different kind of political alignments, from the BBC and journalists to Tory voters to Labour voters, is that they felt that the fact that it was fun, witty, funny, and at a baseline simple enough to be accessible were all critical. We more or less made sure that those things were the case before we launched. And that's about as much work as we put into. There's a few things that we missed out. Like I said before, the CTAs were probably not as developed as they could have been. But that's just because normally games are made over the course of like 3 to 6 months, and we had to do one within like 3 weeks, which from anyone else's perspective is basically insane. So we ended up putting things out. But that's fine.
And along those lines of virality, once you finish the game, you can share your results on Facebook and Twitter. And I'm curious as to how important was social media to the success of the game? I mean, was there a concerted push to have people share it on Facebook and on Twitter?
Yes. So myself and a number of different people in the team were very familiar with, we worked in startups and small companies and stuff, or scalable companies, and we're very familiar with social media virality concepts. And the target audience was 18 to 25, or by extension 25 to 34, which was turned out to be the primary audience. The team is around aged between like 23 and 27, and like most people, we spend our lives on social media, and it makes sense to focus on the prime medium that that age group engages on. As a result, the game was totally focused around virality on social platforms.
And was there a difference between Facebook and Twitter? I mean, I could imagine maybe that Facebook would have a better embed where you could play the game directly from Facebook. I mean, were there any differences, or was it just kind of the same strategy to share across both networks?
Yeah. So, I mean, you generally get better pickup on Facebook than other. So it's easier to get virality on Facebook, I found. So the most important aspect actually is when a friend recommends the game, you'll get a better conversion. So on Facebook, you're typically, apart from promoted posts and the other junk that you receive, most of the posts that you see on Facebook are your friends. We might get a little bit of traction from the various media releases of the game on places like Politico or Waypoint or various gaming magazines and whatnot, and Facebook pages. But fundamentally, people respond better when their friends are sharing stuff. So you might have like 100 or 200 shares or something from a Facebook page post of your game, but those numbers they snowball when a friend is sharing those aspects. On Twitter, we found that, I found this in the various work that I've done on like viral content. Twitter generally has a bit of a lower engagement unless it's around a specific like temporal instance. So like if there's something interesting going on in the world at a particular time, there's a hashtag being used, then you can get virality. And we also made it, the usual stuff. You include hashtags and things in the share text and all this kind of stuff. And it makes it easier to track. It's definitely easier to track virality on Twitter over Facebook. But we also experimented with things like Snapchat, which was very interesting. We tested that in Victoria Park and Brighton Beach. Once we started going viral, towards the end of the week after the initial stress of the first few days, we had a bit of a sit down in an afternoon and realized that this is it's a once in a few years opportunity. You don't get to do this very often, so we should probably test this as much as possible and test the boundaries of virality and understand more about the situation we're in right now, if in case we want to copy this in the future. As what we were living through a success. So we looked at the various aspects and then we realized, we should probably put some better CTAs in the game. And then we started messing around with things like Snapchat, and all these different platforms, and just trying to understand more about the audience that we were working with. That's when we developed the Thunderclap and all these other aspects.
Was that, for Snapchat, was that when you would target to a location and have people swipe up to play the game? Was it that type of advertisement?
Well, it was more like showing a filter when they were taking pictures of their friends in the park.
Got it.
And it's like, play Corbyn and vote Labour, blah, 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 this kind of thing.
And I'm interested a little bit in the back end in terms of data. Like, so you were mentioning tracking shares a bit. I mean, what type of data did you get from having the game out there? I mean, you get the number of downloads or plays, I'm sure, but do you get an idea of who's playing the game, or is there any type of data collection benefit from creating such a game?
So this is one of the things that various groups asked us to focus on, but we didn't really have enough time to implement a lot of this stuff. The data that we do have, we have an understanding of demographics and gender, I think. So we know that our core group, I think like 44% of the people that played the game were 25 to 34, followed by the 10 years above and the 10 years below that. And we know that only about 2% of people above the age of 65 play that game, which is a very interesting statistic. But no, we don't have a huge amount of information. One of the main reasons for that is that we would have a lot more information had the web browser version of the game mostly been shared. But it turned out that one of the really interesting aspects is that once we received our first major media push, which was, so BuzzFeed chimed in, I think it was the Monday afternoon when we launched, and Jim Watterson realized Wobbin Run was going viral, and I think he was in the pub somewhere. I was on the phone to him, and I think he kind of lost that. He kind of forgot that there was a web browser version of the game and only shared the iOS and Android versions of the game, the mobile versions. Mm-hmm. And as a result of that, his copy, his content in BuzzFeed got syndicated, and a lot of different websites, as it happens, and a lot of different websites shared more or less his article in different forms. And as a result, they only shared those two links. They only shared the links to Android and iOS, which meant that nobody really went. After those first few days, there was very little interaction with the web browser version of the game.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted to ask about that. Was the game originally built for, so you're saying you can get more data from the web browser, but was the game originally designed more for mobile or desktop, or how did you see those two different platforms when developing the game?
Yeah, so from the very get-go, we made sure the door was open to porting to mobile by using Unity, because Unity you can port to more or less anything, and just wrap it in whatever platform you want to use. But at the very start, we were in a situation where we didn't really have the resources to develop the mobile version, because it takes a few days of work. And then a friend of ours basically volunteered to put all that stuff on Android and OS, and then made that happen. So I, as the producer, I wanted it to be on mobile the entire time, but we were restricted in that we didn't have a developer to do that. We didn't have someone who was used to, was familiar with App Store optimization, all this kind of stuff that's really important. So yeah, Josh volunteered his time and made that a reality, which was extremely helpful. And as a result, after that, we were totally focused on mobile, because that's where the majority of interactions take place.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. And obviously the crunch time has a certain component to add to that, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, you've had this great success with Corbyn Run. How many times was it downloaded or played overall?
I think it was downloaded between 150 to 200,000 times. And something like, excluding media impressions, which we don't know, I think around 2 million people came into contact with it, which is really quite interesting. I mean, it's multiples of that if you include the media stuff, but we don't know that. So that's quite good. And that's without all the Labour Party sharing all the emailing lists.
Uh-huh. So there's a number of, you can't really count all the metrics.
Yeah. In the future, when we develop more games, our primary vehicle to virality will be using the Labour Party emailing list as far as we're currently planning.
Because, yeah, that was what I want to wrap up with is, where is Games for the Many heading from here? So I've been following your Facebook page, and I noticed you've had a number of these game jams, getting different designers and activists together. Can you talk a bit about those game jams and where things are moving in the future?
Yeah, absolutely. So we ran our first game jam on 2 weeks ago, and we're currently aiming to have another 3 game jams before the local elections in May 2018. In Bristol, Newcastle, and Manchester. These game jams are specifically focused partly on building a community of political game makers that we can activate at the time of a snap general election to make more Corbyn runs, basically, and have more of an impact. And also the games that come out of the game jams, and this has already been the case with last week, where the quality, the relevance of those games to what we were looking for was absolutely perfect. There's games about like the cuts games, a game about like simulating being a Tory councillor, having to make austerity cuts and then having to put up with the political fallout of that, to inequality simulations, to something that can become a persuasive canvassing educational tool. So we're looking at taking games that are generated out of those game jams, not just learning from the mechanics that people come up with and that our own designers come up with, but taking the games forward and hopefully funding them in partnership with the Labour Party and taking them forward, developing them. And that's kind of our focus at the moment in developing new games. So there's a two-pronged approach. Us making games as games for the many, but that's more like beyond May because we don't really have the resources to do that at the moment. And the other half is like working with the teams that make games out of the game jams. Yeah, so we're focusing on making one viral game for the local elections. We're running those 3 game jams. And then after the local elections, in preparation for a snap general election, which we're assuming will happen in about autumn 2018, we'll hopefully by that point be able to ramp up what we're doing. We're also developing a zine with some of the really interesting minds in the games industry and politics, like working on talking about the theory about the kind of stuff that we're doing and application of games to politics and digital campaigning, all this kind of stuff, which is really interesting. And as well as running a podcast and running a series of events and all this manner of these things. It's also worth pointing out we have a Patreon crowdfunder to help us on our way. So we're a busy bunch for the next few months.
Well, do let me know when the podcast comes out, and I look forward to playing more of them. I mean, as you said, it only takes 3.5 minutes, and it's quite fun, and as you said, humorous. So, James, thanks so much for taking the time out. It's been really insightful.
Yeah, thank you very much, Michael.
I've just been speaking with James Moulding, co-founder of Games for the Many, which aims to use the power of play to change politics. To find out more about the project or to play Corbyn Run, you can go to gamesforthemany.org. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics Podcast. If you have thoughts on the show or you want us to cover something in 2018, let us know on Twitter at SMNP Podcast. Wishing you all the best in 2018, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from New Orleans. See you next time.